This video is about the fifth and last key principle of hygienic design that we're going to cover: preventing contamination. I mentioned during the introduction that this is sort of a catch-all, and it's meant to really cover some of the more broad areas of potential contamination around the equipment and maybe within the building. It includes thinking about our handling systems and buildings in such a way that we protect the product from contamination. So this could include things like birds, rodents, pets, chipping paint in the building and in the structure, any chemicals that might be stored in the same place where we're washing produce. Harborage in the building. We talked a little bit about how curbing and coving can help us make that transition between a floor and a wall and prevent harborage. Floors, water supply and drainage, even thinking about where the water goes when we're done using it to wash produce and making sure that we're intentional about that. Preventing backflow in our water supply, thinking about how we get electricity where we need it. Ventilation of the building, heating, even the hardware we use. Lots to think about here, but let's step into it. In the upper right hand corner is an example of using hardware cloth in the construction of a building to prevent rodent access to the building. So we're trying to exclude rodents here, and you can see what was a rat access, a hole that rats had used to access a building, and that hardware cloth goes over that hole as a retrofit. This is 1/4 inch hardware cloth. You can see it's stapled temporarily before having insulation go in over it and be secured more permanently. The sort of central photo there is another example of a curb with coving, nice construction detail that allows for good cleaning of the floor without having water find its way into the wall. And the far right photo, bottom right photo, is an example of a trench drain. This is a fairly narrow trench drain, but it's an example of an intentional floor drain that will help water get out of the area in an intentional way. You can see it's got a removable grate, just two bolts in this case, fairly light. That grate comes up to allow for access for cleaning and inspection as needed. Okay, so what are some of the contamination sources we're worried about? I'm leaning on the Produce Safety Alliance introduction to this topic. So we're thinking about anything that might bring a human pathogen into the mix here, then including humans, other animals, the soil itself that oftentimes the crop is grown in or on top of, the water that we use either before harvest or after harvest, either through irrigation or as our wash water. And any of the building surfaces or areas, the equipment, the tools. So plenty of opportunities here for contamination, and we want to make sure we're being diligent and intentional about thinking through each of them. So one of the ways to think about this is by applying something called lean principles, or principles of lean farming. And these are the key principles of lean. And one of the key ones here when thinking about hygienic design is creating flow. So one way to avoid cross-contamination in particular is to make sure that things are always flowing in the direction that we want them to. In particular, we want to make sure that we're avoiding interruptions, delays, and bottlenecks, and planning for that movement. What does that mean in the pack shed? It means thinking through how our product comes in from the field, goes through a wash cycle into a cooler, and then out and gets packed out. And ideally this would be straight single pass flow as shown in this diagram, where the drains take wash water away, and compost is any culls or seconds are taken out and go in their own pathway away from the wash area. We're always working to make sure things are moving in the direction from the field to the consumer, to the customer, and also in the direction from what is maybe the most dirty in the direction towards what is most clean. We want to make sure, as always, that we're protecting, separating product from waste, including drained water. So this is single pass flow. There's nothing preventing a sort of U-turn setup either. Again, it's about being intentional. So push the wash area over onto one side, and push the pack area over onto the other side. Separate these things, these two activities, again, the dirty and the clean activity, separate them in space and or in time. So the same space can be used for both. We just want to make sure there's a nice deep clean between the two, and that we're preventing cross-contamination between the two activities. We want to talk a little bit about preventing backflow. So we have a full guide about backflow at go.uvm.edu/backflow. These are some examples of strategies for preventing backflow. On the left-hand side is an air gap or a broken drain, and it's intentionally broken. This is coming out of a sink going into a floor drain. And the reason it's broken like that is if that floor drain, if there's a blockage downstream of what we're looking at, and there's another discharge that's feeding into that discharge could overflow that drain, but it would only see the floor, and it wouldn't go up, for example, to the sink that the drain in the upper portion that photo is connected to. So it's protecting the sink from what other sources might be connected to that common drain. That's an air gap. And in the upper right-hand corner are some examples of check valves. And so these are important for making sure we don't have different sources of supply water cross-connected. And we want to make sure that, for example, we put check valves in that to prevent the flow of what might be a water line feeding into a sink, flowing back into a water source that's being used for irrigation, for example. And so there are a number of different ways to do this. Again, more information at go.uvm.edu/backflow. This is an example of using bird netting. Oftentimes we experience wash pack areas being built into barns or existing spaces, maybe where birds have been residents longer than the current owners. And so, how to exclude birds from a barn area where you need to be handling fresh produce. One way of doing this is by using bird netting. This is typically used in the field, of course, for bird exclusion, but it certainly can be applied to the inside of buildings. And what it does is just makes it so that the rafters are not a very hospitable place for birds to get to roost. So pretty economical, simple, passive solution to keep birds keep birds away from roosting overhead. Condensate and dripping is another challenge that we run into with respect to contamination sources, whether it's in coolers or on the left-hand side, or in the case on the right-hand side of cold water lines that are used in hot, humid areas. And so what we're showing here is some clever folks who have used PVC piping as a gutter. And so the gutter collects the dripping condensate that would otherwise drop down onto produce handling areas. And with adequate pitch and an outlet hose barb that runs to a hose, for example, and out the building, is directed away from where it might lead to contamination. On the right-hand side, again, just an example. It's a short section of PVC just to demonstrate the idea. There's a pipe hanger. That white sort of J shape thing is a pipe hanger, and what it's holding on to is half of a 3-inch diameter PVC pipe that's just been cut down the center, and a longer section of that would be hung underneath that cold water line. This is in a wash pack shed in southern Vermont, where the summers get pretty humid, and they are running a lot of cold water. And so what happens is you get condensate on that pipe, and it drips, and there are handling areas and sorting tables underneath and packing tables, and so we want to make sure that condensate does not find its way to that produce going to the consumer. I used this picture. We showed this in a previous video. It was a barrel washer, and we focused on the barrel washer before. I usually use this as a sort of a pause for some engagement from from the workshop attendees. We're in video here, and so I'll cut to the chase. But there's a fence behind this barrel washer, and the question I usually ask is, "That's interesting. There's a fence. I wonder why there's a fence there." And again, we're in a module right now where we're talking about cross contamination or preventing contamination. And so if I told you that on the other side of that fence there are some pigs, the point becomes very clear, right? We want to think about adjacent use. We have a barrel washer set up really arm's length from a livestock area, and so thinking about siting, and maybe this isn't the best spot for this barrel washer. Maybe there's a better place we could put it that would avoid the potential contamination from the nearby livestock. This video has been about preventing contamination. It's the last of 5 key principles for hygienic design on the farm. In the next video, we're going to introduce you to some tools that will help you apply these principles to your farm, your equipment, and your buildings.